Everyone knew that there were tensions behind palace walls, but I don't think anyone could have predicted just how toxic this was going to become. William was devastated. The depth of the rift was laid bare. Such intimate and personal details. Harry was actually repeating conversations that he'd had with William. You just don't do that. Betrayal, disbelief, a hugely low blow. But we're only hearing one side of the story. It's always been abuse coming from Harry towards William. Incredibly damaging for the royal family, and he just has to put up and shut up. Music. So, in 2018, off the back of the royal wedding, which was a roaring success, people were so excited about the monarchy. They were so excited about Harry and Meghan and their inclusion in the royal family and what they were bringing to the table. They were still riding high on that buzz when Meghan announced she was pregnant. But then it got to late 2018 and it seemed everything sort of changed quite quickly because those first reports came through that maybe there were some issues within the Fab Four. The feeling had been that the problems were between the two wives, between Meghan and Catherine, but I think this was far deeper than that. All these years on, we now know that Harry and William's relationship, at least according to Harry, wasn't what we thought it was. Music. Since last Sunday's dreadful news, we have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness of Diana's death. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others and especially for her devotion to her two boys. These were two boys who had grown up in a family unlike any other who had a shared experience, and the perception was that they were uniquely bonded by that experience. The most famous image, I think, which stayed with so many people was of the iconic moment there following the coffin on that terrible day of her funeral, you along with Elle Spencer, Prince Philip, and their dad. It was quite a traumatic experience, I'm sure, for both of them. I think for Harry, he took it all into him. He wishes he never took part in that. It was too much for him. And I think he probably was. I think he could have done with some help, some treatment after that. William, I think when it comes to the death of his mother, he was determined, which shows his character, to not let her down. He wanted to prove that this wasn't going to define him. William didn't really let outwardly show the trauma that he'd experienced. Harry lashed out at photographers, lashed out in nightclubs, got drunk, experimented with drugs. William was determined to prove that his mother's early death wouldn't define him. Thank you so much. Music. They had an extraordinary bond and argued and fought like all brothers do, but were close. Certainly, what I saw was of two brothers who were close. Well done, brother. Well, thank you. I think I deserve it. Sure. I fell off my horse trying to hit you the ball and you missed it. Spoon. Yeah, right. Music, spoon. Did you see it? Spoon. Yeah. It's not a swallow. Charles would have wanted them both to be his support team when he became king. I have no doubt about that. He would have expected Harry and William to be his wingmen. As it stands, he's just got William. And that's disappointing to him. Well, William and Harry did their own things. They are very different individuals. They're very different men, but they also had a lot of shared interests around conservation, around Africa, and in particular around the military. It is still hard work, but I'm better than William, so it's fine. Yeah, it's not bad. You've been helping him with the exact an awful lot. He needs a lot of help. They would travel together on certain jobs and those were always the ones you look forward to because this was the future generation of the royal family. These two young princes who would engage more with the media than perhaps the older generation would. I went out to Lutu with Harry because Harry wanted to bring William out to see the work that he was doing. He is the one person on this earth who I can actually really we can talk about anything. Music. The brothers have always had very different personalities and that comes from their position within the family. William as a future king has a burden of responsibility that weight upon his shoulders, always rather more guarded, rather more serious in his approach perhaps in public duties and Harry as the spare as he now describes himself, but less burdened, able to be more free, perhaps a little more open in his engagements, able to have a lot of fun, a bit of banter. Music. I think very much that comes from where they were within the family. Diana was always very aware that their position, their birth order had a huge impact on them. And it wasn't necessarily a negative for Prince Harry because actually she knew that he always had far greater freedoms to make his own choices than his older brother did because William's life has been set out for him from birth. Harry made no secret of the fact that he wanted to settle down. He looked at his brother and Catherine and their children and that was the life he wanted for himself. But he'd struggled to find someone who could take on the burden that comes with marrying into the royal family. Harry as a prince on paper incredibly eligible, But there comes a lot of baggage with that and an awful lot of scrutiny. And so when he met Meghan, it seemed perfect that he had met someone who was already in the public eye, who knew how to handle herself, who wasn't afraid of the publicity, who was an independent woman in her own right, who was articulate. Really, this was someone who could take this on. Now, they'd managed to keep that relationship secret for quite some time, and then it made it into the newspapers. People were happy. People wanted Harry to find a wonderful woman and get married. And initially, Meghan was welcomed with open arms. I believe I'm right in saying that Catherine and William had watched Suits. So they knew who Meghan Markle was. You know, they knew that there was this glamorous actress coming over from the United States, and they saw how happy Harry was. Harry was always one of the most popular members of the royal family. And when it became clear that he'd found someone that he wanted to settle down with, I think there was a lot of joy for him, a lot of excitement. And Meghan was exciting. You know, this American actress who had, campaigned for girls' and women's rights for the UN, who was not afraid to speak out, who had had her own life and her career. This was really exciting. There was a huge sense of optimism. We love you, Meghan. And a huge sense that this couple could be a really modernizing force within the royal family, that they could have a real impact, particularly when it came to engaging with younger people, to engaging with the Commonwealth, real areas where the royal family has sometimes struggled to connect. Buckingham Palace proudly announced the engagement of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. God save the Queen. We're thrilled. Thank you very much to both of them. I hope they'll be very happy indeed. Brilliant. And as I said, America's loss is our game. We had high hopes for this. There was a lot of optimism. However, it was false optimism. The rift was definitely going on fairly early. You know, soon after Meghan's arrival, we were hearing stories of falling out. I think the moment that we realized that there was tensions between the brothers was after I printed a story in Vanity Fair about William just urging Harry to take his time because they were engaged. Of course, William had taken many years before he proposed to Kate Middleton because he wanted her to be able to know that this was what she wanted for her life, too. And I think, what was meant to be well-intended brotherly advice landed really badly with Harry, and I think was the start of the real unraveling of their relationship. I mean, it really hurt him that he felt he didn't have his brother's backing over Meghan. I think that Willie was, like any brother, was probably just keeping an eye out for him by saying, "Do you think this is happening rather quickly? What do you really know about this girl? Should you not spend some more time getting to know her?" Which had a bad reaction. He was really unhappy about that. He couldn't reconcile himself about that. Post then, it's just been a gradual unraveling of the relationship. I'd been told that at Christmas when Harry and Meghan went to stay with William and Kate, Harry had complained to his brother that he wasn't sort of making enough of a fuss of Meghan, wasn't rolling out the red carpet, that she didn't feel terribly welcome. These were things that myself and other journalists were picking up at the time. Once things had died down a bit after the wedding, I was told by people who've been involved with the wedding, people who knew some of the senior members of the royal family, that actually all wasn't really very well at all between Meghan and Harry and William and Kate. When we first started to get hints of a rift between the two couples, the Cavendiges and the Sussexes, the perception was that actually the problem was between the two wives, that Meghan and Catherine did not get on, that there was a clash between them, and that was where the problems came from. Actually, what we now know from Harry's multiple accounts in Netflix and in Spare and in the various interviews that is given, that the issues were there between the two brothers, and they were there before Meghan came on the scene. Perhaps Meghan was more of a catalyst for Harry saying enough is enough. I want to go. But it didn't start with Meghan. There were tensions there beforehand. Music. If you go back and analyze scenes now, you can almost every time pick up a vibe at the Royal Foundation. We saw the four of them sitting on stage together, and there was that very nervous laughter when they were asked if they ever argue or disagree on anything. Working together as family. Do you ever have disagreements about things? Oh yes. The reactions from all four of them are actually very interesting now with hindsight, knowing what we know, which is that things actually were quite awkward between them all. I guess in hindsight now those words carry far greater weight. Well, you're putting on a great show if it's not. Meghan was a pretty forceful big character to come into this Fab Four, and we saw it when they were on that stage for their foundation, and she had to have her say, and I think the other two were very conscious that William was taking the lead. She was less conscious. You'll often hear people say, well, you're helping women find their voices. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because women don't need to find a voice. They have a voice. They need to feel empowered. And people need to be encouraged to listen. I think she outsmarted all of them in terms of the way she looked, the way she presented, which would have probably put William's nose out, I think. And that's what it seemed to me. Well, the Royal Foundation started off as the foundation of Prince William and Prince Harry. It was set up in 2009. And it was an umbrella organization to bring together their philanthropic endeavors. In 2011, the Princess of Wales, the Duchess of Cambridge as she was at the time, joined the foundation. And then when Harry married Meghan, then she became part of it too. And it became the Royal Foundation of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And it was seen as bringing together these two couples, the younger generation of the royal family, and harnessing the power and the platform that they had. So when it was announced that Harry and Meghan were going to take a separate path, that they would be leaving the Royal Foundation and setting up on their own, well, this was really big. This spoke volumes about the state of the relationship, that they couldn't collaborate on charitable ventures together. Now it was put out that this was so that they could each pursue their own different paths, that their lives were going to take very different courses. Of course there were different expectations on them and they had different interests, and this was to allow them to champion their own interests. But we all knew that this was much more than just about them doing their own thing. This was about the fact that they just could not work together. They were separating their offices. They were all based in Kensington Palace. They shared a lot of the same staff and they were separating their charitable endeavors. And that looked pretty final. Harry and Meghan were leaving London. They were heading to Windsor. They were putting distance between themselves. This was not just a small spat. This was far more serious. And then when Harry and Meghan went to South Africa, a really successful tour on paper, but one where they gave an interview, Meghan talked about how unhappy she was, and Harry talked about he and his brother being on different paths. And that was the first confirmation from Harry that things between him and William were far from rosy. Everyone knew that there were tensions behind palace walls, but I don't think anyone could have predicted just how toxic this was going to become. Well, January the 9th, 2020 was an extraordinary day. I've been covering the royal family and the goings-on of all the senior members of the royal family for many, many years. But this was a story like no other. There had been a build-up for this Brexit over many, many months. I think the birth of their son probably was a catalyst when Archie was born to really start looking about what they wanted to achieve. I was on the trip with them to Australia and all that in the islands, and she was very unhappy. He wasn't very happy at all. I think they started to look very seriously, say, we don't want to be part of this. It felt like an abdication in all but name, and in that very word sort of sends shivers down the spines of the likes of the Queen and senior members of the royal family, because the abdication was so hugely damaging. Harry was an absolutely vital and integral part of the royal family. We knew even back then when the Queen was on the throne that Charles's vision for his monarchy once he became king was a slimmed-down version. Nonetheless, one that very much included Harry and Meghan. So to sort of take these two key figures, and let's not forget very popular figures because they were out of the equation, felt very, very strange indeed. Well, the Sandringham Summit was formed very quickly after this statement, that came out of Harry and Meghan's spokesperson announcing that they were stepping down, and it was essentially a meeting in the Long Library at Sandringham for the Queen, for the Prince of Wales, of course, Prince Charles at the time, Harry and William, these key players. We now know that tensions were running very, very high at the Sandringham Summit. There were carefully coordinated arrival times so that William and Harry arrived through separate entrances. There were rumors that Harry, the Queen, and Charles had sat down for lunch beforehand. Certainly the summit was bookend, and with tea breaks and an opportunity to just bring the temperature down because tempers were heated, and that the emotions were riding very high, as you might expect when you consider that the Queen was completely blindsided by this announcement. And in the twilight years of her reign, in her 90s, the Duke of Edinburgh is about to reach 100. He never made it. But he was pretty elderly and very frail by that point, long since retired from public duties. At a time when Harry and Meghan's role as senior royals was incredibly important to the royal family, the Queen needed that support. So, there was a sense that, they were being let down by Harry and Meghan. We had a situation where there was the new generation of royals, William, Harry, their wives. They're all out covering these royal engagements and all working together for the firm. And then suddenly Meghan and Harry were just gone. And William and Kate have 3 young kids. They're balancing parenthood as well as royal duties. And the fact that down the line they will be the king and queen, that's all coming for them anyway. And to have to take on more of the royal burden at this point and quite abruptly would have been a real shock to them both, particularly in the way that it came about. So they're not only picking up the slack when it comes to royal duties, but they're also dealing with quite a media storm around Harry and Meghan's departure. After the Sandringham Summit, things are clearly difficult. This is a very tough decision that has been made, and I think there was a sense of betrayal from William that his brother was leaving. There would have been a sense that you know you're leaving me to it now. That's it. But the damage wasn't final. Now, if we look at William and Harry at Meghan and think there was a rift and that there was a terrible relationship between the brothers, if we think back at the Commonwealth Day ceremony just a few weeks later, it was Harry and Meghan's final engagement as working royals before they flew off to America. And in the royal procession, it was listed that Harry and Meghan would not be in it. And it upset them. So what did William do as the kindly older brother, as understanding his brother's feelings despite everything that had happened? Despite Harry disappearing off to America, despite the Sandringham summit, what did he do? He pulled him and Catherine out of the royal procession so they could walk in at the same time with Harry and Meghan. He helped his brother out there at a very early stage. He continued to do that despite there being a rift. The Oprah Winfrey interview with Harry and Meghan was the big moment when the depth of the rift, the depth of those wounds was laid bare to a global TV audience watched by millions. And they didn't hold back. It was incredibly damaging for the royal family. And the headlines haven't stopped since. Well, it was all absolute proof. Before that, we'd had Harry saying, "We're on separate paths," which had infuriated William. But this was worse. This was much worse. This was telling stories out of school in the worst possible way about your family. And I think really William could not believe after all that they've been through together and the complaints about privacy and the media intrusion and everything they all said. There was Harry intruding upon his own family's and privacy, and in the most grotesque way really. Some of the stories were awful. So I think that rightly women, we just could not understand why he was doing this. There was so much in there, and the one thing that came out, the one thing that still sticks from that Oprah Winfrey interview is the racism allegation, which is perhaps the most damaging allegation you can make against an individual or an institution, particularly coming from Meghan, a mixed-race duchess. It would have been devastating for William to watch his brother make such claims about his family, that he had turned his back on his family, that he was prepared to do such damage, and because this was incredibly difficult for the royal family to respond to. And I think for William there was a sense of betrayal. There would have been a sense of disbelief. And for a family who have always put duty above all else, this was a hugely low blow. You could tell how strongly William felt about this when he decided to respond to a doorstep question, as we call it, when a journalist shouts a questioner at a member of the royal family as they're walking past. And he was asked, "Have you spoken to your brother since the interview?" "No, I haven't spoken to him yet, but I will do. And then can you just let me know, is the royal family a racist family, sir?" They were very much not to raise his family. Normally protocol would dictate that they would not respond to that kind of questioning. They would have ignored it. But William did not feel he was able to ignore it. This was so serious that he had to respond and get it out there on the record how he felt about that claim. Prince Philip's funeral was the first moment when we saw the two brothers back together in public after the Oprah interview. Body language expert, every member of the public, every journalist scrutinizing every move and every nuance to try and get a glimpse of what might be going on. Could this be a moment for reconciliation? The funeral of Prince Philip and the death of Prince Philip was very tense because I think that a lot of people, including maybe even the Queen, felt that the extra stress that had been put on Philip wasn't fair. He would have felt the whole thing was appalling. Absolutely appalling, this lack of duty by Harry and way it was being carried out. But the Queen was very frail and very sad, and she would have expected Charles to do more and to sort of take control of this whole issue. She actually at that time was leaning more on William and having more chats with him. So she would have found the whole thing very distressful because to her Harry was a very popular member of the family. At Prince Philip's funeral, Harry wasn't allowed to wear a uniform because he had been stripped of all his titles. William was able to wear a uniform, but he said, "Okay, I will also wear a suit and walk with you, Harry." In many ways he has held the hand of friendship out to Harry. We saw that it was Catherine really who was choreographing this moment, who brought the two brothers together as they walked out of St. George's Chapel in Windsor. They'd been in the procession to the funeral service, but they'd had their cousin Peter Philip strategically placed between them. On the way out, we did see a moment where they are together, and there's the merest hint of a conversation between the two brothers with Catherine's wife and sister-in-law playing that mediator role. We now know that after the funeral service, there was a meeting between Harry, William, and their father Charles in the grounds of Frogmore House, at which Charles said to them, "Boys, please don't make my last years a misery." So affected was he by this devastating fallout between his two sons. Applause. Post-Oprah, they did manage to put on a united front. We saw them appear together. They unveiled a statue for their mother, Princess Diana. And they managed to do that together. There was even a bit of laughter and chat between the two of them despite everything that had happened. And so it didn't look final there. It looked like they'd be able to work this through, and once Harry had got himself settled in his new life in California, that perhaps things would get easier for them. And of course, We now know that hasn't been the case. I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. Throughout her life, Her Majesty the Queen, my beloved mother, was an inspiration, an example to me and to all my family. And we owe her the most heartfelt debt any family can owe to their mother. The death of Queen Elizabeth was a huge moment for the country, a massive moment in history, the end of the Elizabethan era. She was the only monarch that most of us had ever known, and there was a sense that she would go on forever. And so I think in public there was sadness, shock, and a sense of unease about what was to come. This stabilizing force had gone. There were real fears if Meghan and Harry came over they were going to spoil the whole remembrance of the Queen and they were going to take center stage. Now William I was very conscious of this getting out of control, cause even whilst we were all mourning the Queen there was that long-running narrative what's going to happen with this feud, and I think that we probably thought let's just draw a line under this for this moment in time. We're not healing. It's not the end of the rift, but it shows respect to the Queen. And that's exactly why I think he did it, to see them together on such a huge occasion after the death of Queen Elizabeth. It gave hope that perhaps this moment was going to be a catalyst for reconciliation, that those wounds could be healed, that they had had time to come together and that they would sort out their differences, air their grievances and put them behind them. And I think it was in a very sad time a happy sight. Clearly behind the scenes it was far from happy. Things were extremely tense and extremely difficult. And this was nothing more than a public show. After Oprah came Netflix, the 6-part documentary series Harry and Meghan, where they continued to set out their version of life within the royal family behind palace walls. They very much pulled back the velvet curtain, and the image they portrayed was not a particularly pretty one. The timing of it was also incredibly difficult. The trailer for Harry and Meghan came out just as William was landing in Boston for the Earthshot Prize, his big legacy project, and yet all the headlines were on the negative perception of the royal family as told by Harry and Meghan. What I think they did manage to do, that all those people, those massive deals they got, was to capitalize on his sense of injustice. And he was clearly in a case, seemed to be quite traumatized by her whole experience of leaving the royal family. Meghan was far more composed. Even with the interview with Oprah, she sort of knew what she was saying and she presented it like an actress, and she knew it was going to be a bombshell. Harry, when you look at him in the beginning of some of these things, not so much in Netflix, but in terms of that Oprah interview, he would look decidedly uncomfortable. But as things went on and the money kept rolling in, I think that he realized that this was his way to make the money that he needed. Once Harry had committed himself to this commercial world, it's over. And when you do a book like Spare, they wanted everything. After Oprah and Netflix, I wondered what more there could be to come. But in Spare, Harry delivered more and more blows, particularly toward his brother, Prince William. Shock waves through the palace. Absolute picking up of jaws collectively around the royal residences. I mean, yeah, they were floored by it. Spare just went so deep into all sorts of details he didn't really have to put in. But the biggest story in Spare, I still think, was the fact that his brother had physically attacked him. Harry describes William coming round and grabbing him by the collar. Harry falling to the floor and breaking the dog bowl. The context to it was that William was unhappy about Meghan's alleged treatment of staff within Kensington Palace, and that he had gone to confront his brother Harry about it, and that confrontation had ended really, really badly. Indeed, we'd all heard the stories that things with the brothers were not good, but the idea that Harry and William would come to physical blows, be tearing each other's shirts, falling over dog bowls in the kitchen of Nottingham Cottage over Meghan. That plus very intimate conversations that were revealed between Harry and members of his family was very much airing his dirty linen in public and really upsetting his family. Harry was actually repeating conversations that he had had with William. This isn't right. These are private conversations. We have no right to know what Harry and William said. One of the conversations was after Prince Philip's funeral. You just don't do that. I mean, that's disgraceful. These things would have really annoyed William. For years, he has been worried about leaks in the palace, about people writing about his family. He knows that it is bad for the future of the monarchy, for everybody to be seen to be bickering and fighting and falling out. He knows that when he becomes king that he can't have members of the family causing controversy. William was devastated by Spare. He couldn't believe that his brother had revealed such intimate and personal details. He's pointed out a number of times that when you're in the royal family, you're basically silenced at times. And yet here he was coming out with all these allegations, knowing that his brother really didn't have the same right of reply. They're not able to put out their side of the story in the same way. So, you can only imagine when these allegations were getting fired over to the palace that they were received with extreme fury and frustration. Remember, we call it a rift, but it is a one-way rift. It's always been abuse coming from Harry towards William. William has not entered into this sphere. His knot is not gone down to the level of Harry. It's a rift, but in public, it's just Harry against William. William has kept his silence and has kept his calm. In Spare, Kate really is portrayed on a number of occasions as someone who's a little bit too stiff, a little bit formal, and cold, particularly in relation to how she treated Meghan. Now, that being read by William, who is of course would be fiercely protective of his wife, that would have to have sat so badly with him and would have really infuriated him because it is quite a negative portrayal the whole way through. He's incredibly protective of his wife, understandably, and Harry didn't paint a particularly kind picture of Catherine in the book. There was also a critique of royal marriages that appeared to be a little pointed that before Harry others had to marry for duty, pick the right person rather than for love. And that would have stung. And that Harry's perception was that everybody else had been protected, but when it came to Meghan, she didn't receive the same treatment totally, forgetting that it had been incredibly difficult for Catherine during her relationship with Prince William. She had faced media scrutiny. It wasn't all plain sailing. Meghan was not the first person to go through this. I think that was a red line for William in the same way that it was a red line for the king when Harry crossed that line and you know how to go at Camilla. He's a big man. He can take Harry slagging him off in his book. What he can't stand for is Harry slagging off Catherine or revealing stories about Catherine or leaking conversations that Catherine has had with Meghan about her emotions. Harry had previously said that Kate was the sister he never had and always wanted, and all of a sudden she's being sort of portrayed as this rather cold character. It would have been really disappointing and extremely frustrating, I imagine, for William and Kate. The thing with William is he would bear that grudge, and I think that it was too near the lucker in terms of him criticizing his wife. All sorts of stories that were critical of Kate. Deeply personal things that were said. William was not going to have it. I think that would have hurt him, and I think that may well have been his red line. We've heard an awful lot from Harry and from Meghan. We've heard so much, but we're only hearing one side of the story. You will never ever hear Prince William's version of events because he can't do that. He's in a completely different position and he just has to put up and shut up. That must be incredibly frustrating, and it's incredibly difficult to just sit back and take it and not to be able to put your side across. But it has always been the case within the royal family that once you start trying to come back and you open up those floodgates, that there's no going back from that. It is better to say nothing. The dynamic between the king and William and Harry has been a very special and unique one since the passing of the Princess of Wales. Charles had to step into that role of being a single parent, and you know it has gone through transformations and challenges. No, I'm thinking back to the time when the three of them set up United for Wildlife, something that was so important to all three of them, and when you consider that moment and compare it to now where we have a king who's living with cancer, you know Harry himself has said he doesn't know how long his father has. There's no closeness because that trust has been broken down. And no relationship with his brother. Yet I think you look at that situation and it's incredibly sad because it is the breakdown of a family and a once very close trio. A lot of what Harry covered in Spare was his relationship with his brother. You know, a relationship which, you know, my very first book, William and Harry, is all about that sort of unbreakable bond between these two boys who were united in grief when their mother died, who had always sort of supported each other. And we learn in Spare that actually it wasn't a close relationship, that there was a lot of sibling rivalry, as you might expect, a lot of jealousy, a lot of Harry feeling that he didn't want to play second fiddle. Nothing left. Is there? But no, essentially what nothing. There were very illuminating anecdotes that I think said so much about Harry as a person and his relationship with his brother. The fact that, you know, he'd always get the smaller room at Balmoral, that William always got paid more attention because William was the prince who was going to be king. Harry was the spare. I mean, the very title of his book is so loaded. It says everything really about how Harry felt about growing up as the second born in the royal family. One of the really sad parts that was revealed in Spare was Harry revealing that he and William just were never as close as we thought they were. He really went back through it all and listed all these specific points, like when he went to Eton where William already was attending and William said he didn't want to know him there, and things like that where you think the brothers are really close and that William is the protective older brother. But suddenly you've got Harry revealing that that wasn't how he felt at the time at all. One of the really shocking revelations in there was the fact that Harry wasn't William's best man, which we'd all been led to believe at his 2011 wedding to Kate. Harry said that it actually was two other friends of William's and things like that where we had this perception of the two brothers there, you know, being so close. Harry was supporting him at the end of the aisle, and at the end of the day, he wasn't even chosen as William's man. That was quite a surprising revelation. And again, it just really changed what we thought their relationship had been. I think the most obvious visual symbol of how this rift affects the monarchy came when the king and Catherine both had cancer and both of them were out of the public eye, and we had those images of the royal family that were just dwindling in their numbers. You had to keep asking yourself, If only Harry and Meghan were here now to share some of this responsibility. And I think for me that was one of the most glaringly obvious examples of just what had been lost by both sides failing to come to some kind of compromise and work out a way that they could all work together. It's certainly not going to be reconciled anytime soon. I mean, William will not speak to his brother. And I think when you consider that the coronation wasn't a moment for a reconciliation, the King's cancer diagnosis, the Princess of Wales's cancer diagnosis, these were opportunities to perhaps bring the brothers together, and it hasn't done. So, I don't see a reconciliation anytime soon. I think William's still far too angry and disappointed in his brother. I sadly do think that the relationship between William and Harry is unsalvageable. And I think we have seen this play out with Catherine's illness. There was an opportunity there, I think, for Harry to help or to Harry maybe to put a statement out when there was so much online bullying. There was an opportunity there for him to be the bigger man and help his brother, but he didn't do it. I think what happened to Catherine was a huge shock to William and it made him look at life in a different way, and I think he was able to move on from what's happened with Harry. I don't think Harry's moved on. I think Harry's still bitter and is still moaning and is still waiting for some kind of reaction. He's still waiting for his brother to, come out and talk to him. William's not in the position that he was a couple of years ago where he was stressing about it or agonizing about it. I think he's realized after what happened to Catherine that it's just not worth getting all upset and about what his brother's doing.